We're talking with Mitch Sherman of The Athletic. Mitch, you had a sit down or a I'm not sure if it was a sit down or a Zoom or whatever you want to call it with Nick Henrich.
Yeah, that piece was fantastic
recently, and he's had one of the more interesting careers at Nebraska, from being a pretty highly touted 4-star in-state kid to some of the obviously being part of a coaching change, obviously coming back from the injuries to retiring after this past season because of another injury. When you sat down with him, you mentioned earlier about how, Nebraska doesn't know how Dylan Raiola ticks yet. It seemed like we got a lot of insight this past year on Nick Henrich and how he ticks. What did you learn about him between what you saw him coming back from the injury and then your sit down with him for the interview for The Athletic?
Well, other than winning championships and playing in the postseason, sadly, he's a guy who I think has experienced about everything in his football career. You kind of laid it out, Ravi, but state champion at Omaha Burke, started to get hit with the knee problems even back when he was in high school. One thing I didn't know until Nick and I talked, and college players, when they're still active, aren't necessarily jumping to reveal the details and extent of all the injuries that they've endured for obvious reasons when they have competitions and games still ahead. But one thing I didn't know about Nick, and he was happy to tell me after his career ended, is that he tore both of the PCLs in his left and his right knee, one in high school and then one during the COVID year in 2020. Didn't have surgery on either of those because that's not required. He was able to rehab them. And then the ACL in his right knee went out in the Purdue game a year ago in 2022. He had that repaired. And then he did it again. And just kind of in a tragic way too, in overtime against Wisconsin, in a game that, not to dig up this old wound, but that didn't need to go to overtime in the minds of a lot of people. So it was the fourth down play. Henrich had just been in on second down and blew up the pass protection and chased Tanner Mordecai out of the pocket, forced a 3rd and long. Mordecai, he came off the field, was okay. Mordecai scrambled to get within 1 yard of moving the chains inside the 5. And then Wisconsin ran it for a first down, and he got blocked or tripped or pushed from behind by an offensive lineman. And you could see it. I went back and watched the replay and put in the story together about Nick after I talked to him, and you could see him just crumple to the ground, and he knew right away that he had done it again. And at that point, there was so much damage in that knee. He hurt the meniscus on this injury too. They had to use a cadaver body part to repair the ACL this second time. Just completely unrealistic to expect that he could come back and play football after that second surgery that he had. So he had no choice but to just give it up. And there goes the NFL dream, because this is a guy for a lot of his career that you could see going and playing in the NFL. I don't know, if he turns into a starter, if he turns into a practice squad guy, a special teams, but I mean, there was a role for him somewhere probably in the league, and it's gone right there after that long list of injuries that ended in the Wisconsin game in November. So to hear his perspective was really interesting, not just on the injuries and the decision that he had, but on his experience at Nebraska through the coaching transition to Matt Rule, and just what he thinks about Tony White and this team going forward.
Stay right there for me, Mitch. What did you take away, or at least what were some of his biggest takeaways from playing under Coach Rule and Coach White for 1 year? Because it seemed like he spoke pretty highly about the two.
Yeah, I mean, Nick's a class guy, and he wouldn't have agreed to the interview if he had bad things to say about anybody that he played for. So it was totally expected that by me that he would say things along the lines of what he did. But it was still I think enlightening to hear him talk about the transition and how the older players on the defense, probably the older players in the locker room, he mentioned Bryce Benhart too in the conversation. They didn't know what to expect when Matt Rule came in. And for the first few weeks that the coaching staff was coming together, they were almost entirely focused on recruiting and putting together that 2023 class. So the returning players didn't get to know them, until we got to about this time last year. And they went to the convention. They came back. They started to work with these guys as Nebraska got into winter conditioning and the mat drills, and that's all the stuff that's coming up here in 24 that I'm sure we'll get a heavy dose of on social media and snippets when we get time with coaches and players. But a year ago it happened under just, I think, a lot of uncertainty. The returning players, and Nick voiced this, they were worried that this new coaching staff would just want to make it all about their guys and bring in their guys and kind of throw the veterans to the side. And he said, that couldn't have been more inaccurate, that as soon as they started to get to know these coaches, they realized how much they valued the older players at Nebraska. And it's probably why the transition, while Nebraska was 5-7 and that wasn't what the Huskers wanted, the transition still went smoothly in 2023. And as far as Tony White, he said that he's not played for a coach who was as dialed in on what an offense was doing, as intuitive and instinctive in how to attack things from a defensive perspective as he felt in this year under Tony White. So, I think he shares the feelings that a lot of people who've watched Tony here over the last 12 months have voiced, in that he's got a really bright future in this game, and Nebraska's fortunate to have him back for another year.